What's going on today? Brandon here again. So I've got a tutorial today. This is a real-time painting. I've got some winter cardinals back here that I did on a little bit larger canvas. We're going to do a real-time painting tutorial of this one, winter cardinal, just a male cardinal here on a smaller 8x10 canvas. So if you want to paint along with me on this one, the colors that we're going to be using, we're going to be using a little bit of Phthalo Blue. I've got some yellow medium, some yellow ochre, some permanent red, titanium white, raw umber, and permanent black are the colors that I'm going to be using on this one. We're going to be using about 4 different brushes. We're going to need a small, basically like a spotter brush or a liner brush if you've got it. You're going to need maybe a small angled brush or something that you can do some detailed work with. Then maybe something a little bit bigger, an inch and a half kind of brush to do background with. So grab those if you want to get started with me, and let's go. Okay, so what we're going to do here is, and I'm using a small canvas. This is an 8x10, I believe, is what this is. So it's not a huge canvas this time, not a big project. That way we can get this done in a fairly short period of time because we're not having to paint such a big overall scene here. We're going to do a male cardinal here in a little bit of a winter type scene, and there's not going to be much to the background. Again, we're going to keep this nice and simple. I like to sketch in here with the pencil what my overall position and the way the bird is going to be sitting in the composition here. I like to start with a pencil sketch. If you just want to go ahead and put your background in and freelance your bird on top of that, that's perfectly fine too. I like to put my pencil sketch in first just to give me an idea of how the bird is going to be situated in this composition before I do anything else. And I also like to make a couple of lines on here to give me an idea of where I'm putting my colors when I'm blocking in. So the pencil sketch helps me. If you don't like it, that's, you know, whatever you want to do, because again, this is the way I paint a cardinal in a winter scene, or one way that I paint a cardinal in a winter scene. There's certainly lots of different ways you can do this. So we're going to get started on this one. I'm going to use a fairly large brush here just to paint this background in. I'm using acrylics. I use some water on my brush to kind of thin things out a little bit and get things moving. We're just going to do a very basic background of gray, basically a gray background with a little bit of maybe a hint of green here and there put in this. I don't know, we'll just see. But anyway, we're going to lay some color in for this background initially with mostly a couple of different shades of gray, a little bit of white, a little bit of black, a little bit of brown. Make it look like an out of focus winter type atmosphere in the background. So we could have some snowfall going on back here. We can have some trees going on back here. We can have you know, a variety of different limbs, and it could be a fence back there. I mean, who knows what's behind this bird. It's really up to you and your imagination what you want to lay back in there. So we're just going to put in some color, and this initial color is going to be some fairly thin acrylic again, and we're going to kind of let that dry, and after it dries we will come back in with a little bit of other colors and do a little bit of fading and blending of some things just to make the background a little more interesting. But again, this is going to be a pretty simple background that is not going to have much detail in it at all. We're going to put 1 or 2, maybe foreground limbs in here in this picture, that this bird obviously is going to be sitting on one of them. and we may add another one or two somewhere else. When you're putting this initial background in like I'm doing, I mean, you don't have to really worry about the directions of your brush strokes so much, because again, I'm going to probably come back in here with some other things after this initial background layer dries. So we'll have a chance at that point to even up anything where we have brush strokes showing that we don't necessarily want showing, or clean up any lines that we don't like. We can do all that after this initial layer dries, so don't be too concerned about it on this first pass. And just put some color in. I mean, you know, I think that most of the time when I'm doing a winter scene like this, I like to keep these background colors pretty neutral. I don't like to put a bunch of bright crazy stuff in on a winter scene, obviously, so when you're keeping it with your neutral tones and gray, brown, tan, and you might can throw a little bit of green in there for some evergreen type trees that could be going on in a winter type scene. But obviously outdoors in the winter months, you're not going to see a lot of flowering plants and stuff like that. So if you're trying to do a winter scene like this, having pinks and yellows and purples and reds and all that kind of stuff in the background is usually not the direction I like to go, just for the simple fact that it's kind of out of place for a winter type scene. But again, you're the one in charge of your painting, you do whatever you want. So we're going to keep laying in some colors of brown and black and white. I keep, again, a little bit of water here beside me that I can touch this brush in every now and then like that when I feel like it's not flowing quite as well on the canvas as I want it to be moving. Things are starting to get a little tacky on me, a little dry with acrylics, and that happens pretty fast sometimes. I can come into a little bit of water and get things moving again, not a problem. And again, you know, this pencil sketch I've got in here is just a loose sketch. I mean, it's not exactly 100% saying that I gotta paint around the lines, so to speak there. I'm gonna try my best to keep most of that sketch somewhat intact. That way I'll have something to go with when I start putting the bird's colors in. But I'm not too worried at this point if I cover up some of those edges. That's not a big deal. In fact, you want to cover up a little bit. That way, when I put the blocking in layer of that bird in, I won't have any lines I have to clean up later that don't have paint on the canvas. Don't want any of that canvas still showing through. So, alright, now there is pretty basic drab looking wintry background color. Now as this dries, we're going to come back in with a little bit of variety of those same shades of gray, and just change up the intensities in some areas a little bit to make it look a little bit more interesting, and then maybe add in again some hints of some pine kind of colored green, maybe some evergreen limbs that's back there in the background. Kind of like that little dark area that I ended up with right there in front of the face. I'm going to try to leave that for now. It just adds a little element right there in front of that bird that's kind of interesting. So, and again, stuff like that just kind of happens as I was going. I mean, when you have something like that happen, you're laying a color in, and you come back and look at it, you know, it's kind of interesting right there. You might want to leave something like that. So now we're going to come back over the top of some of this and just mix up the values of some of these grays a little bit. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and paint the edges of this particular canvas. If you want your edges painted, you can go ahead and make that happen real fast too. I mean, some people Don't care if the edges of the canvas are painted or colored at all. I've done them both ways, but now I'm going to switch brushes. I've got another brush here that's just an old kind of beat up brush that I do a lot of smushing and jamming into the canvas with, so it's kind of beat up on the ends a little bit. But what I like about it is I can do some color blending with it a little bit nicer, because I have essentially beat this brush up a little bit from time to time. So some of my nicer brushes, if that's what you want to call them anyway, I don't like to jam into the canvas so much, so when I'm doing this kind of work here, I'll switch over to this brush that I've already done a lot of that with. It doesn't hurt my feelings as bad when I smush it in the canvas like this. So if you see what I'm doing right here, just basically taking that brush and mashing it into the canvas right there, creating a little bit of a textured effect there. And who knows what this is? I mean, it could be a bush that's out there in the back. Could be any number of things going on in the background. We're just adding a little different element to what we've got going on. Again, just to make things a little interesting. And I can kind of blend these edges and make them real soft, again with this particular brush. And we'll probably come back over that with some other things and change it up a little bit too, so who knows. We'll come up here in the top corner now with a little bit of a lighter shade of gray and fade some of that over. Making little circular motions is what I'm doing with this, kind of just smashing it into the canvas right there. I think I might do the same thing over here, give an appearance of maybe we've got some snow falling that's going on back here and everything's kind of blurry, out of focus. So I like the way those edges are turning out right there. I think I'm going to keep that process going through the middle here. Let's add a little bit more brown, a little bit more black in there, maybe just a hint of some blue. Why not, right? Yep, there we go. So now I can come in here and put this darker bit in and swirl it around. And what we'll do is we'll put a little bit more light over the top of that here as soon as that kind of dries for a few minutes, while we're continuing to bring this color down a little bit. And again, this is really just totally random, so I'm just kind of making this up as I go. Now, as we get down here towards the bottom, let's introduce a little bit of that darker, maybe pine green color, like we've maybe got some kind of, maybe there's an evergreen tree or a holly bush or something back there, maybe that's got a touch of green in it. So there's just a little hint there of some green. So we'll say maybe there's something living back there that's got some green to it. Maybe there's something living down back there that's got a little bit of green to it. Something to that effect. And I think we'll go back to a little bit of that brown that we were bringing over from here to finish off whatever is down here below this particular cardinal. Something back there in the background. Now, since we've done this in layers, you can see that we've created much softer edges essentially for the background than what we would have had if we'd have just did this as one, or done this in one layer essentially. Now we might go with a little lighter color with some blue in it now to come up in here. And anytime with acrylics that I'm trying to create a little bit better blend or fade in an area, sometimes I will add a little bit more water to an area or to the brush where I'm trying to blend, and then use my fingers to smudge it around, kind of like that. So don't be afraid to finger paint, right? You can create a little bit of a smudgy blend sometimes with your finger. And again, just kind of some small circular motions with this brush here, bringing in this other color, smudging it with my finger a little bit, blending that down. And now we've got our second essential layer of our background in place. So we've gotten pretty good canvas coverage at this point with 2 layers of paint having gone on. Now I want to sit there and look at that and say, okay, so what do I think I've got going on in the background? What do I want to change? I think I want to maybe fade this line up a little higher on this side. Something like that. Okay. Now, what we want to do is maybe put the indication of a few distant limbs back there that are, again, not really in focus. So we're just going to put in a little bit of a darker brown, black, gray kind of color here. It's just a little darker than what our background is itself, and I'm probably going to have to put it up here on the canvas and have a look at it. That's pretty close. Darken it up just a tad. Yeah, maybe something like that. Might actually be a little too dark. So how you fix that is you just take that tone down a little bit, a little bit of white in it maybe. Yeah, I think there we go. Some kind of limb back there in the distance. Maybe it continues on to the back side here. Maybe has a couple of other branches coming off of it. And again, this is meant to be a fairly out of focus limb that's kind of off in the distance a little bit. So we're not too concerned about any detail here at all. In fact, we don't want any detail, because if you put detail in it, it's going to make it look like it's a little closer in. So there's kind of a distant limb over there. Oh, maybe there's another one. Need to get a little bit more paint on the brush apparently. Maybe there's another one coming in just ever so slightly up there. That you can kind of make out. And maybe there's a piece of one coming in from over there. And really, we're just putting in indications in the distance that there's some kind of limb back there. Something like that. Now we will put a foreground limb in here that our bird is sitting on. And really all we're going to do here is put in a real dark, really leaning towards the black side of things. And you have to make a decision. What kind of angle? Let's see, his feet are going to be living somewhere in this area. So if his feet are like that, I don't want to cover up my background limb a lot, so I'm going to take this and turn it. Make this limb go at a bit of an angle that way. And then carry it on off that direction. And we're going to just put a dark color in here for this limb, because then we're going to come back in it and put all our detail on top of it. And maybe it's got a branch that comes off in this vicinity. So it looks something like this. Alright, so now we have pretty good background sitting there, and we have a limb foreground in place and some background stuff. Now if we want to add a little bit of the illusion here that we got some snow going on in the scene, I'm going to go back into a little bit of the white here, create a little bit of a gray on a smaller brush, and we're going to basically blob in some out of focus areas of that lighter color. To give ourselves the idea that we got some snow happening. And I am just putting the color up there and then smudging it out with my finger. And depending on how heavy of a snowfall you want, you determine how many of these things you want to stick in there. And I do a variation of intensity of them, because some of these will be closer obviously to the camera, some of these will be further away. The ones that are further away are even more out of focus than the ones that are closer to the camera. So you have to decide just how hard it's snowing in our little scene here. And we may put one or two snowflake indications before we're done that are a little bit brighter in their intensity and a little sharper edges to give the appearance that they are really close to the same distance that our bird is, and so they're actually quite in focus. At this stage in the game, though, we're not worried about anything that's really detailed or in focus, and I'm just kind of getting a little happy with my snowflake brush here at the moment and just adding them all over the place. But at some point here you have to say, okay, that's enough, and I think maybe one or two in a little closer to the bird himself. Alright, I think maybe we're going to call it done. So let's get started with blocking in our cardinal. And what I like to do is block in my cardinal with really the darkest tones of the colors in the areas that they're going to be in, which is pretty simple in some of this stuff. Like around the face here, he's pretty much just black. So we're going to come in here and put in some black. Now I don't want to lose where my eyeball is going to be, so I'm going to put his eyeball in there and leave just a little bit of canvas showing around that until I get to detailing that part of the face and the eye out, so I don't lose where that eyeball is supposed to be going. But since the cardinal is pretty black in that area, we're just going to put some black in there. Now we're going to come in and really put in some dark, basically dark red is what we're looking at here, because the cardinal himself is mostly red, obviously. But for me to lay in some red feather texture that looks the way we want it to look, we got to put in a really dark red layer behind it, and down here in this tail especially, because the underside of a cardinal's tail, excuse me, is definitely got some indications of dark red to it. So let's come in here with a really dark red. Might almost look black in the camera, but trust me, there's red in there. And start with this tail. Make the bottom of the tail a little uneven, obviously, because he's got feathers that are coming together down there, so you don't want just a straight line. On the bottom of the tail, you don't want a straight line anyway. And I always like to keep the brush strokes at this stage in the game at the direction that the feathers are actually laying. That way, if you end up with any texturing from your brush strokes or lines that are visible, they will be in the direction that the feathers are laying. So here for this tail section, obviously, I'm taking these brush strokes straight up and down because that is the direction that these feathers are laying. Okay, and then now I'm going to keep that same dark color essentially to go what would be the underside of this one wing that's kind of visible back here. We're going to keep that nice and dark initially. Maybe even the outer edge of it. And his feathers are a little bit darker up in this area too, so we're going to put this real dark red color we've got going on in this area as well. Something to that effect, probably. And now, for the rest of his body, I'm going to just lighten that up a little bit. We're certainly not getting into the actual red that the cardinal is red at this point, but I'm not going to go quite that dark as I did that other stuff, so I just slightly lighten up the red value a bit. And of course we're going to detail this limb out, so it's okay to get your paint right up to it, a little over where you've put this foreground limb in there. That's okay. And maybe you can tell there that our red value is at least a little bit lighter than what we were dealing with on the tail and on that back wing feather. Just enough that we can see that there's a difference. And again, keeping my brush strokes essentially in the direction that these feathers are going to be laying. So for the most part, it's going to be a vertical brush stroke through a lot of this area. And we just keep this going until we've essentially covered up our entire cardinal. Now obviously the top of his head there, he's going to have some feathers sticking up, and we'll deal with those pretty much at the end. Now these feathers along the back of the head do kind of move off towards the back of the bird, so my brush strokes change a little bit in that direction. Once you get back here to the main body though, again, it's pretty much just straight up and down. Get a little bit more paint going here. Just to finish him out. Now then, we've got our bird blocked in. With the exception of his beak. And for that, you know, you really have to end up finishing off that beak with some oranges and yellows and some highlights there towards the end. So what I think I'm going to do, just to block it in and not have that white beak sitting there, I don't want to lose my facial expression here where I think his mouth comes up. I'm going to drop that in just a little bit with some black there. So now when I kind of paint over that, you should still be able to see that there. But his beak is essentially going to be some oranges and reds and yellows there towards the end. So I think we can probably block that in with the same kind of dark red we've been dealing with. Let's just have a red beak for the time being, until we come back and put the proper colors in. But it's a lot easier to see your lighter values and highlights and make them work properly when you've got the darker color behind it. So there we go. We have essentially blocked in everything now, and we can get started on detailing some stuff out. So hopefully at this point our foreground limb that this bird is sitting on has dried enough where we can get started detailing it out. I'm going to basically use the same smaller brush that I was just blocking the bird in with. I'm going to come into our darker colors again, our blacks and our browns. Now I don't know what kind of limb we want to do here in all honesty. I think though we do want to maybe put a few indications of a little bit of snow sitting on the top of it. So we'll do that maybe as the final stage here. But all we're going to do here is work in a couple of layers of creating some highlight on this limb, just to make it look more like a limb, I guess I should say. And we're mostly going to use more browns and blacks, and maybe a little tiny bit of red. And let's come in here and start on our top line and basically use almost a crescent kind of shaped brush stroke. As it comes down, giving just a little bit of an idea that that is a rounded object that this bird is sitting on. And again, we're going to do a couple of different layers on this, so this is not going to be the finished limb, obviously, but we're adding step one. We have basically lightened up our values just a little bit over that dark limb base. And we are creating these short crescent looking brush strokes on here to make limb texture, basically to make it look like it's a rounded limb. Starting from the top line of it. Now this one that comes off, this branch that comes off, I'll take it up until about the halfway point there into that limb. Do the same thing with it. And there we go. I think we'll leave the bottom of the limb fairly dark. We'll assume that it's a cloudy sky with snow falling, so we don't have a central light source, so to speak, of a sun to deal with in this particular scene. So it's just probably going to be the lightest at the top of the limb. So we're going to lighten it up even more here. And while we're at it, we're going to throw in just a hint of some yellow ochre in this thing, in our mix here that we're dealing with. Now let's come back in here again, and same kind of brush strokes. I'm not worried about full coverage. I've already got a base layer in there, and I've got a secondary layer of color. Now I'm doing more of a highlight color pass, so I'm not completely covering this limb on these little strokes. I'm just lightly touching it. If you can see that, it's certainly not a full whack of paint going across there. Again, I obviously have no idea what kind of limb we're trying to create. I just know there's a lot of limbs out there that you look at them, they have these kinds of colors in them. So we're just going with some very generic limb colors. And there's actually quite a variety of colors in a limb if you really look at them. I don't know if we have to get quite that crazy and detailed for this, so we're just going to work along and do that. Now we're going to come in again with an even lighter value. Okay, we came in with a little bit of a lighter value there, and I added it across the top of that limb just as my camera SD card had timed out there on us. So all you missed really was I came back with one more layer of an even lighter value of that color across the top, and then the last thing that I was doing when I noticed that the camera had timed out back there, adding what was pretty close to just pure white in a couple of places along the top of that limb, just to give the indication of a little bit of snow sitting on the top of that branch. And so that's where we are now on that. We've pretty much finished our branch and our foreground limb anyway. Now we're just going to get started on this cardinal himself. So all we're going to really do on this cardinal is layer in lighter values of his red feather on top of that darker background until we basically get it the way we want it to look. Now I'm going to start down here at this tail because it's going to have some visible feathers that you can see like individual lines on. So let's come down here. We got this darker color in, and let's just clean up with that darker color some of the lines that are in there, some of the brush strokes that are kind of visible in there a little bit. Something about like that. Now these tail feathers on these cardinals, they've got some pretty dark values of red down in there, so I'm going to really darken it up a bit again and come in here in the middle and create what is essentially some individual feathers by making some vertical lines in here of some different values of red and dark red. If you look at any pictures of cardinals for references of how these things look, you're just going to see that there's a variety based on how their tail feathers are overlapping and what's going on. So you don't have to get real specific here. You're just going to create a few darker areas of red in there, and then we're going to create a few lighter areas of red in there to give the idea that there's several different feathers laid in there. So all I've done there is put some darker red in, and you can already see that we're starting to get the indications of some different feathers that are going on there. Then we'll come in here with just a little bit of a lighter red along an edge, maybe in here and maybe there. Alright, so now we've worked through our SD card timing out, and we've worked through a battery change here, so we're going to keep going back with our layering of color on this tail. And again, right now we're coming back with some really light color to put in some like feather veins on here, creating the idea that we've got multiple feathers laying in on top of each other along this tail. And we're just adding lighter colors and darker colors and doing them in a couple of different places. And then ultimately I'm just kind of rubbing in some different values of that color as well, because on tails, I mean, you got all kinds of stuff going on. So realistically, you don't have to worry about being very specific on this kind of stuff. I mean, these birds all look slightly different. So kind of whatever you're feeling, wherever the brush lands, that's what you create sometimes. But I am using a much smaller brush for this. This specifically is a spotter brush in a 10-aught size. Whatever you've got that's tiny that you can get in here and do some detail work is perfectly fine. I'm going to get on some of these feathers now. I'm just going to come in here and rub in some variety of highlights and things just to break it up. I mean, you don't want a very monotonous looking color across there, because that's not really how it looks in real life. So anything you can do to come in there and just create different color values going on, some sheens and reflections and highlights that's going on these feathers, the end result just looks a little more realistic. So that's all I'm doing. Just adding in some variety. Okay. I think our tail now is in a pretty good position. Let's get started on some of the rest of our bird here. Now, since I've got this little small brush in my hand, I'm going to go ahead and come in here underneath this limb with some short little vertical brush strokes of a couple of different red values, just to create the indication that there is some feathering going on underneath there. And then right along the edges of where that body feather kind of meets the tail, there's just a hint of a lighter line there sometimes. So we'll come in there and I put a bit much in there that I don't like quite that strength of it, I'll just blot it out with my finger right there. That way it blends it in a lot better now. Just a few individual feather highlights with that lighter, almost pinkish color there. Again, you don't want everything looking monotone. You want some variation for sure. It makes it look very realistic when you're done. Alright, let's move back over to a slightly larger angled brush now to refine our edges on our bird. Let's get some of that corner in a little bit better right there. And this belly here a little bit better. That's pretty good. Now, let's come back here on this back wing. Again, I'm going to move back to this little small brush again because we got to get back on some detailed work. Let's refine the edge a little bit of that wing with this darker red that we laid in. And the underside of that wing is fairly dark usually. And we just want to give the indication again that there's a couple of different feathers in there, so I'm going to come in with some really dark red right next to the body here. And then we'll come in with a bit of a gray highlight color and put in the edge of a feather that you'd be seeing just the edges of on the underside of this wing. Stick that like that. And then a little bit of highlight on the edge of that outer feather. Now, I'm going to go back into another angled brush and start working on the body of this cardinal. We're just going to go into some red here. See what we get on some short little vertical strokes through here to create some feather texture. And again, you're not worried about a monotone 100% even coverage of color here. In fact, you want to purposefully not do that because that's not how this bird would look like in real life. And now we're going to get some feather strokes that are going towards the back up here in this area. Really come off the face. These short little feathers come off the face and move towards the back of the bird, so that's the direction that we're going to move our brush. And as you get down to the front where his belly is, you'll move your brush back down vertically again. Alright, now on his head we'll put a few brush strokes moving up towards the top. And then we will now move back to our smaller detail brush, where we can work with individual feather detail now. Put in some of these sprayed off the top of his head there. Alright, so that is essentially another layer of feather in. Now we're just going to put a variety of different values of our red in here to create a couple of different layers, and I'm going to just use this small spotter brush to keep doing this because I'm trying to create a little bit of individual feather texture at this point. So I'm not going for a full coverage of any of these brush strokes. Now, to really brighten it up towards the end here, we're going to essentially have to put in a little bit of yellow in our mix to almost give an orange highlight appearance. Before I do that, I'm going to lighten up my red just a little bit and go with some individual brush strokes of a little bit lighter red. And ultimately these winter cardinals, especially along the back here, almost have some, and we'll start putting some of this in now, some of these gray, individual little gray feathers or gray highlights to their feathers. So back here on the top of the head, these feather strokes move towards the left in this particular, the way I'm drawing this one, towards the back of the bird. And I'm just having to keep going back in and getting more paint here because this small of a brush, your paint runs out on you pretty fast. So you really have to come in and keep loading some color on. Now, let us put our eye back in here so I know what I got going on. I feel like my bird's got a little bit more personality to him when I can see his eyeball. Alright. That makes me feel better. Now there's, you know, some variety of darker red that'll play out on some of these areas. Something to that effect. You don't want to totally lose all your dark. Okay, I brought this in a little bit tighter here so we can do some work around the face. Still using a small brush now. We're going to clean up these lines a little bit. And then we're going to detail the beak here and the eye. So, we're going to get into some black first to do this part of his face. Basically, this is just putting some color in around here. It doesn't have to show a lot of detail, as in all honesty, you can't really see a lot of detail. Okay, so for this eye, we need to have a little bit of a kind of a gray colored highlight all around the perimeter of it. Basically to establish the outer edge of the eye here. Something about like that. And then we need to create the reflection that the eye itself usually has on it somewhere. Since we don't have a real bright light source here, we're just going to kind of put a highlight across the top of the eyeball. That might be a little too much blue for me, so I'm going to drop that down and make it a little more gray. Tone it down just a tad. And then we'll come in with not quite pure white, but close to it anyway, and put in a little bit of a reflection right there at the top of that eye. And now we will go back into our black and put the indication of a rougher edge of some feather coming off of this darker area around his face, where you just bring it out into that red a little bit, just to basically create not a smooth edge there. And then you can even carry a little bit of that black feather off the front, fuzzy that up just a little bit. That looks pretty good. Now for the beak itself, we're going to have to get into a couple of different things. We're going to want a dark kind of reddish, almost leaning towards purple line right there where the mouth is closed. And then up from there we need to transition some red into orange. So you can use a little bit of red and yellow mix, obviously, to start to achieve that color transition in here. Probably going to take a couple of layers to get this the way we want, so I'm going to put in a little bit of a lighter orange color here towards the front end. I'm going to leave it a little darker towards the base of this beak where it's attached to the face, so I'm going to leave that pretty much that darker red color that I laid in, and then just lighten it up towards more orange as it goes out. And actually it being more on the yellow side on the outer edge of that beak out here towards the end, I'm just going to put in almost just a yellow on top of that red that we've got already there. And then we can worry about kind of fading and blending it all together. So there's a little bit of yellow on the front end. And now we'll get more orange in the middle here. And as these layers dry, it'll allow me to put more layers on top of them, obviously, so we can create an even better blend once we do that. Now we're going to need a little bit of a highlight here along the top edges of the curve of this beak. Really here as it's coming into the mouth. Basically like that. Or I just lighten the value up a little bit. And then we're also going to need to do that same thing at the very top where our sky is kind of creating a highlight across the top of the nose here. There, I think we like that. I think I'm going to go back into my yellow and put just a little more of that yellow color in the front. And now come back over it again with a little bit more of that orange. To blend it back in. Now really all we have left to deal with here is some more of the feather highlights themselves, which in all honesty is just again coming back in with some lighter values of red, cleaning up our edges a little bit. So I'm going to come back in here and bring some of this red around on his shoulder. I'm going to bring in just a little bit of that oranger mix color that we're using on the beak to hit some individual highlights in here. Now you can see with this smaller brush just some strokes in there that are going to show a lighter value of that red, brighten it up across the front of this chest. And again, you're not looking for full coverage here, you're just looking for some individual areas of highlight where we're brightening up the front end here a little bit. Doing this just adds a little bit of three-dimensionality to your bird painting. So basically you're just coming in here with some individual highlights of a lighter shade of that orange color. Just to liven the bird up a little bit. And then in a few places, we're going to actually come in back with this kind of light gray color that we highlighted the tips of these feathers back here with. And we're going to put some of that in and around a few random places on the bird's chest. The more color variety you lay in on something, it just adds to the overall composition, gives it a little more character, keeps it from being such a dull, just monotone red color, which, you know, a cardinal, obviously when you look at it, it looks like it's just a mostly red bird, but if you really get in there and look at what's going on, there's a variety of things going on these individual feathers. So the more of that you can put in, the more interesting it becomes. And you don't have to go overboard with it, just to whatever extent you're happy with. That looks pretty good to me. Now we've got to put our feet on. To get our feet in there, we're basically just going to come in with some black to start out with. And he's got one foot maybe somewhere in here, and a bird's foot, they'll have 3 claws across the top wherever they're sitting, and then there'll be one coming from underneath that you'll see a part of, that wraps around. With this skinny of a tree branch, his claws are probably going to be wrapped all the way around it. So we're going to go with something like that. The same thing over here on this side. He's going to have another foot hanging out here that's going to have 3 claws coming out, wrapped around from the top side. And you would have one kind of coming from underneath that's hanging around a little bit. Maybe we'll dangle it just off the branch like that. And now we need to get a little bit of some gray color and come in here and add some highlight on those, a little bit of the joints themselves. You just basically touch a couple of places to break up that darker background color. And make it look segmented, so you're leaving a little bit of that dark in the middle. And then we really lighten it up, getting close to the pure white again, but not quite pure white obviously, and put in just a few highlights of what would be, I guess, a knuckle in terms of what's on our hands on this, on these claws where the joints and the bends are. So there we go, pretty quick and easy on some feet. Not very difficult there. And since it's snowing, let's lay in a couple of snowflakes that are almost the same distance away as that bird itself, that are going to be a good bit in focus. So let's take a little bit of blue and some white to create a darker flake color that we're going to put white on top of, so we actually have some three-dimensionality to these snowflakes right here. We're going to put in just a few that are, so again, this is just some blue and some white. We'll have a few snowflakes that are very much in focus. They're going to have sharper edges, crisper colors to them. So we're going to put in this blue first. Maybe one down here along the bottom. Alright, and then we're going to take some white, and I'm just going to go with straight up pure white. I mean, you know, it's snow, right? So might as well snow that's falling in the air. On my brush here that's a little bit frayed out and worn a bit, and I'm going to touch it in there on top of that blue color. Not with full coverage, so you can still see some of that blue coming through there, and that will give us the impression of a three-dimensional snowflake. It's basically a wad of individual snowflakes stuck together in a clump, is how a lot of these fall. There. Now that's given us a pretty good finished product there, our extra little snowflakes there at the end. There is our finished winter cardinal. I hope you guys enjoyed that one. If you liked painting along with that one, want to see some more stuff down the road, subscribe to the channel. I have some more stuff coming in the future. Give me a like there and a thumbs up if that one was good for you. Drop me a comment if you want to. And we will see you next time.